Here is Sailor Studio 441, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. While this is a nice vivid blue, it isn't as bright a blue as the swatch. Now there's some tone change as the paper and pen change, but this isn't really a shading ink on most papers. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, there is some tone change, but it generally stays a vivid tone on the page. I really see this easily being an ink that is in many pens at the same time. If you have a bottle of it, it is good enough to make you think, oh, I want this in whatever pen. It is a really good ink. The pen for today is a Pelikan M805 with a broad nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here we get to see really how nice and vivid this is, though not as bright as some other blues like this. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does have a few brief moments of shading, like gain on the second line at the end where the left side of the G is lighter than the right side of the G during that downstroke, but then it keeps the darker tone through the rest of the word. Really, we're not getting a lot of shading, but we are getting a nice vivid blue. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Bungubox Ebisu. Here is Sailor Bungubox Fujiyama Blue. Here is Sailor Bungubox Hatsuyumi A Fuji. Here is Sailor Bungubox Melancholic Gray. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. We still have a nice vivid blue on the page, though it is not as vivid as it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. You can see that width on the second line, where the WI are lighter than the TH at the end. Mountains above that, the left side of the M is darker than the right side of the M, but then it holds a dark tone through all the rest of the word. In the end, I think we have a beautiful tone on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we can easily continue our notes back here because there's no bleeding, no ghosting, only smiling faces. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. We get a little bit of a tone shift here. It goes from being a vivid blue to being kind of a vivid blue-leaning turquoise, showing this ink is a little bit translucent as an ink. Not a big deal. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does have a tiny bit of shading in that we can spot a couple of lighter areas, but that's not the thing here. It's not really a shading ink. So I am gonna say that, beautiful, vivid tone that's just not blue anymore. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we can easily continue our notes back here as we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we're happy about this. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, and it stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, making this good for students to use to take their notes in a lab environment. Other than that, it's not really a resistant ink. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't really shade. It does a really good job of looking good on the page. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Sailor Hatoba Pure Blue. Here is Sailor Kobe number 7. Here is Sailor Kobe number 17. Here is Sailor Kobe number 48. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. The tone we're getting here is certainly lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does, I think, shade better than it did on any of the other papers. So it could look great for a student taking notes. Take a look at Goblins on the third line, where the G is a nice mid-tone. It gets a tad bit darker during that O, lightens a bit again to the BL, the INS at the end, very dark. So it's shading its best here. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our lab notes, getting extra credit points from the teacher for using such a good-looking ink. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Jeherban Rule Dance. Here is Sailor Studio 573. Here is Diatramensis dianthus. Here is KWZ El Dorado. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. We still have a vivid blue ink on the page, not as pronounced as the premium papers, as the Clairfontaine. It does have a little bit of feathering and a little bit of spread. It is copy paper. We should expect these sorts of things. There's no real shading going on. I'm going to say this passes, but go with a finer nib for this type of paper. Looking at the back of the page, we do see it gets deep into the paper, meaning you could not write back here. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The broad wet nib of the Pelikan M805 really exploits the vivid tone of this and gets you to want to write more by its consistent, vivid tone with only the tiniest bits of shading that are happening. Now, off camera, I used a dry fine and it did tone down, but still didn't really shade much more than it did with the wet broad. It isn't a world of difference as it went from the wet to the dry pen, but there was a difference. Give me the wet fine or medium for that little bit darker but brighter tone on the paper, I think is worth it over your drier writing pens. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.